This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. Welcome to the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. I'm your host, co-founder, and editorial director of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, Jamie Bogner. This week, I am on location again in beautiful Skagit Valley, Washington, sitting outdoors under a tree in the beautiful location of Garden Path Fermentation in Washington State. And across from me are Amber Watts and Ron Extract, founders of Garden Path Fermentation. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Jamie. Great to be here.
We've known each other since I think it was the 2015 the Wisconsin Craft Beer Festival. At that point, you all were with Jester King and came up to represent the brewery at that ill-fated Wisconsin festival, and then came up the next year in 2016, I think, for our Minnesota Craft Beer Festival, which was our rebound. And has continued to be a fun event that we throw in the Minneapolis Convention Center. But in that meantime, you have gone out on your own, started this brewery, Garden Path, here in Washington, set out to focus on brewing beers that are of place, beers that are made with Washington ingredients, local ingredients, and beers that kind of express that terroir of this location here. And you very specifically chose this location because it offered all of that for you. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about some of the ways in which you make expressive beers that kind of capture the flavor of the place that you're in, and we're going to talk about some of those technical means in which you guide and create these beers that taste in a very specific way, despite using some, I would say, more open-ended approaches to brewing beer. Still, that flavor matters, and making beers that feel compelling to people is an important piece of this all, and you engage in all of that. Before we do that, as the brewing industry's premier choice for glycol chilling, G&D Chillers has set the standard on quality, service, reliability, and dedication to their customers' craft. New this year, redundancy meets efficiency. G&D's micro-channel condensers are built with all aluminum construction, which eliminates galvanic corrosion. Using half the refrigerant of conventional condensers with fewer brazed connections translates to a lower GWP and less opportunity for leaks. Call G&D Chillers today to discuss your project or reach out directly at gdchillers.com. This episode is also brought to you by Raw North Star Pils, a new base malt to set your compass by. Raw North Star Pils is crafted for brewers looking for a domestic Pilsner malt with low color and low modification. North Star Pils carries overtones of honey and sweetbread, supported by flavors and aromas of hay and a nutty character, suitable for any beer style, but particularly craft-brewed versions of classic lagers. Let Raw North Star Pils guide your craft by visiting bsgcraftbrewing.com or contact them at 1-800-374-2739. So Amber and Ron, give me the nutshell history of beer, together, apart, and what led you here to launch Garden Path.
We could say it is a garden path. It was kind of a long and winding road to get here. Ron's been in this industry since before he could drink legally, basically.
That's true.
Yeah.
I started, my fascination with beer started when I was in college, and I spent a summer abroad working in the UK, tending bar at a real ale pub there, and then just kind of got deeper and deeper into the industry. I went to graduate school in Chicago and worked at the campus pub there and started to meet some other folks in the industry. I ended up leaving my graduate program eventually to pursue a career in beer. I went to Siebel in Chicago and just doing the short course there, worked at a local brewery for a while, and then kind of moved into the retail side of the industry because of lack of real opportunities on the brewing side at that point, and eventually went from retail to wholesale distribution, importing, and then eventually back to brewing, or at least to, brewery management and ownership. And then, as Amber said, that ultimately led us here to Washington State. with the goal of really doing something that was a little bit different, doing something where we could be closer to our ingredients, where we could embrace this sense of place, this sense of seasonality, brew without a lot of exterior temperature control, source everything from ideally within a few miles of where we are, and which we do for the most part, where we source about over 98% of our ingredients from here in Skagit Valley, with the one exception being some of our hops, which we have to source from a little bit further afield, but still pull entirely from the Pacific Northwest. And we also work with 100% native yeast, but we do it in a way that's really meant, as you mentioned earlier, to bring out softer, more balanced flavors, not to create aggressive tartness or aggressive barnyardiness. We're not looking for Brett bombs. We're not looking for acid bombs. We're really looking to present things that are delicate and nuanced, with maybe some undertones of tartness and funk that will add complexity but not dominate the palate.
And Washington State is such a great place to make beer that way, just because the climate is so conducive to Saccharomyces versus other organisms that could produce more tartness or funkiness. So, we don't have hard freezes in winter, or we maybe have one. It's never really hot in summer. It's always cool at night. So we don't need temperature control to keep our yeast hoppy, which is pretty awesome.
It's basically cellar temperature year round here.
So you very intentionally chose this location because of the environmental concerns, also the agricultural surroundings and the ability to source those ingredients. And it's almost like the perfect conditions for making this thing that you want to make. And I do like that idea, though, that, while you are expressing the terroir, you're also guiding that expression so that it produces, flavorful things that are also still pleasant to drink, and not just whatever you get out of that. And we're going to talk a little bit more about, how you do that. But talk to me about why. I mean, from a broad philosophical, standpoint, why?
That's a big question.
Yeah.
Well, I think part of it is that you don't necessarily think about beer and terroir as going together. Historically, if you go back to the history of farmhouse brewing in Europe, everything was about terroir. But in the past century or so, beer has become more of an industrial product, where you can make the same beer, in Washington or in Kenya, with the same recipe, the same ingredients, and it's not expressing anything about the place it's made. And frankly, we're in one of the most beautiful places I have ever been to. We're so lucky to live here. And
I will 100% agree with you. This place is absolutely gorgeous.
And we want to tell that story through a beer.
The storytelling aspect, it's definitely a big part of it. It's a big part of our story, I guess. That looking at beer as a form of live performance. I don't think it's a way that people tend to typically think about beer, tend to think about it as something that can be experienced again and again. And so much of brewing, as Amber alluded to, is dominated by this idea of reproducibility, of making something that's consistent and eliminating all variables so that you can make something consistent, so that when you see a certain label, a certain name, you know what to expect, and it delivers on that expectation. And I, as a beer drinker, appreciate that there are beers out there that I can, where I can have this kind of set expectation and it delivers on it. It's a lot like having a meal at your favorite comfort food restaurant, where you go and you know exactly what the setting's going to be. You know what it's going to smell like, what it's going to taste like, what it's going to look like. Even if you haven't been there in a decade, you can go back and have exactly that experience that you anticipate, and it is comforting.
Chucking Up Hills is perfect every single time you have it.
Very comforting beer, one that I personally love to drink. But there's also something to be said for your favorite farm-to-table restaurant, where every time you go in, the menu is going to be different. You don't know what you're going to be presented with, but you know that it's going to be fresh, seasonal, local, and thoughtfully prepared. And that's what we're trying to offer in the beer world. It is a form of performance art. If most beer is kind of a digital recording, what we're offering is much more of a concert or a show. It's a one-time experience. It's something that involves things coming together in a unique way based on the circumstances in which it was made, based on varying conditions. And our job is to serve as editors and curators to make sure that what we ultimately present is ready. We're kind of the directors there. And it's like when you go to a concert or a play, you don't expect it to be the same as what you've come to see or hear before. But if you have confidence in the directors and performers, then you know that it's going to be something special and unique. And that's what we're trying to present with what we do, is something that is going to be different, often in subtle ways, but different nonetheless. But that will be a unique experience every time.
Sure. I want to dive into the kind of guardrails that you build around that, because even though you can riff on things and you can build that unique experience, there is still a commonality and a thread, through it that you want to build. Before we delve into that question, the world of craft beer is a different place now. Margins are more important than ever, so why not lower your ingredient cost? Craft juice concentrates from Old Orchard are the cost-effective solution for your fruit-forward needs. Old Orchard produces high volumes of their retail juice brand, so economies of scale keep prices low for their bulk supply program. A little concentrate goes a long way, and you won't lose some of it through filtering like you would with purees. To start increasing your margins now, head on over to www.oldorchard.com/brewer. Also, for years, BreweryDB has been the industry's only professionally curated source of brewery and beer information. In 2019, over 1 million brewery visits were made by craft fans searching for breweries on BreweryDB.com. In just a few weeks, BreweryDB will unveil an all-new experience to help craft lovers get back on the brewery trail. To take full advantage of the enhanced marketing power of BreweryDB and increase your taproom traffic, set up your account on marketmybrewery.com. That's marketmybrewery.com. It's easy and it's free. So as much as, you start riffing, like if I show up, to see someone in concert, I know they're going to play with the kind, I'm familiar with the band. I know what they're going to play, and they may mix things up and, go off on a solo or, throw another song into the mix or something along those lines that provides that fresh live experience, the thing that we go and enjoy about, and, seeing that kind of thing live. But there's still a framework around it. How do you build a common thread for Garden Path so that people, even as they are experiencing these different seasons, these different expressions, that there is still something familiar for them through that?
So part of it is our yeast culture. Our house culture has, except for our spontaneous beers, we've used it in everything we've ever made. And it does change and evolve over time, but it's, a progression that you can kind of taste over every edition of our beer. The other thing, though, is that with all of our beers, if we make it a second time, it's never going to be exactly the same, but it's the same philosophical idea behind it. So the first beer we ever released was called The Garden Path Led to Flowered, and we can talk about our naming conventions later if you want to, which is kind of a riff on some of our favorite hoppy Belgian-style golden ales. And so every edition of Flowered has been a hoppy Belgian-style golden ale, fermented in an open foeder with some aging, probably a little bit of blending. But the grain bill is going to be slightly different. The hops are going to be slightly different, just to kind of capture what is there at the time that we're making it.
For some of the additions, we've blended in some older beer from barrels. A couple of them we just did a single component, and it depends on what the beer is telling us it needs to be the best version of itself. So we never have anything really carved in stone as far as our process goes, or certainly as far as our timetable goes. We have an idea of how long things might take based on past experience and based on having done other things that are kind of similar, but it's always evaluating it. We'll never have a situation where on a brew day we have the whole calendar plotted out for this is going to spend X number of days in the open foeder. I mean, usually that's about a week, but that can vary a bit. But then from there, will it get transferred into stainless? Will it get transferred into oak, get split between different types of vessels? Will we blend in older beer from other barrels? That really is all just kind of a judgment call based on what we smell, what we taste, and what we think it needs. And if we see it going in a direction that we think is kind of interesting and cool and unique, then we'll lean into it and we'll explore variations of the theme and differences from what we've done in the past. Or if we feel like it ends up being very similar to something that we've done before and we like it, that's cool too. So it's really just kind of following where the beer takes us, which in some cases may be a place that we didn't necessarily expect to go, but that's beautiful and worth exploring. And that's kind of the nature of the garden path.
That is a difficult way to run a brewery where, you're going to brew some wort and you have an idea for what that beer might become. But you are constantly having to evaluate and react and replan potentially in order to push that beer into some direction that may lead you in a different way than you thought. It's how do you, from a practical standpoint, do that? I mean, even thinking about am I going to make a decision about X or Y or Z today as I taste this beer? That's just an unusual and a way to operate in a brewery.
Well, a big part of it is surrounding ourselves with the right team. We need a team that balances that sensibility of wanting to explore and wanting to explore variations and different ideas, different approaches, but that also is practically grounded enough to be able to actually get things done. We can be a little bit on the idealistic side in some ways, so we definitely need some more practically minded people, but our idealism can probably drive some of those folks a little bit crazy. So it is a tough balance to strike, but I mean, for me, I don't think I would want to be doing this if all we were doing was just reproducing things over and over again. I can understand the appeal of that. I can understand the appeal of making really tiny, fine adjustments to just constantly try to improve on things and make it better. And then once you feel like it's perfect, to just keep doing it and to define oneself on it. But that just doesn't speak to me. I like the variation. I mean, I'm a philosopher. I like to explore, and
sure.
I think I would get bored if all we were doing was just making the same thing over and over again. So I love that what we do is the expression of a moment, that it's something unique that we know exists once and will never be recreated in quite the same way. That kind of ephemeral nature of it is what makes it so appealing.
And I mean, frankly, our yeast does what it does. It does different things in different temperatures. It does different things depending on the grain bill. So we basically just kind of have to listen to the yeast and let that guide where something, what it turns into.
Like any artist, though, there are themes that one might come back to. There are, shapes and forms that, one might find more attractive and again, continue to use and rethink in ways. And so for you all, as you've been working through this kind of experimentation over the last few years and figuring out, are there some common threads through some of these beers that you find yourself, making more often, or that things end up falling into, kind of specific threads?
Well, I'd say the common thread through everything that we do is that we really like to explore subtlety, nuance, softness. We like things that are really balanced, that you can that you can just sit and enjoy without overthinking, if that's the approach that you want to take. But that if you do really want to subject them to that level of thought and analysis, that will hold up to it, that have the layers there. We definitely are not a producer that makes things that are meant to be consumed in 1 ounce samples among hundreds of other 1 ounce samples. We make things that are meant to be enjoyed by the glass, and I don't want to release a bottle that I wouldn't want to finish, basically. So anything that we put out there, I feel like it's got to be something where you can drink a whole bottle of it and kind of crave a second, whether you want to drink it at that point or not, but look forward to exploring it further. But as far as the recurring themes within individual products, we use names, as Amber alluded to before in talking about our first release, The Garden Paths Led to Flowered. We do multiple editions of different beers with the same name. And the idea there is that we're not recreating what came before, but we're adding another chapter to the ongoing story of that product. We're exploring variations of themes, as you say. And in the case of Garden Paths Led to Flower, that theme is something that is inspired by kind of bitter Belgian blonde ales. Beers like XX Bitter was one that was particularly inspirational to us, but exploring our own interpretation of that kind of concept. So we do have a number of things. We have a beer called the Prime Barrel Age, which is just a blend of some of our favorite barrels from our cellar. And each one is going to have different components, different barrels that go into that blend, but that's the theme that beer is. Another one called the Curious Mixed Methods. We kind of play on the intersection of spontaneous and non-spontaneous fermentation techniques. Either in one case we did a blend of spontaneous and non-spontaneous barrels. And another, we took some wort from the cool ship and put it into a freshly emptied barrel that had previously had non-spontaneous beer into it. So there was a little bit of a co-fermentation going on. For another version, the first version of that beer that we did, we took wort from the cool ship and used it to inoculate another portion of that batch that had gone through the heat exchanger, along with a very small pitch of our house yeast. So they kind of worked together. But each one was a different exploration of how we could kind of blur the lines between spontaneous and non-spontaneous fermentation. So we like to kind of choose techniques like that. And we do one-offs. We do things that may have started out as one-offs, but that we may ultimately decide to explore further. We love working with local fruit. I mean, that's a recurring theme.
Sure.
And we do 2 different series of fruited beers in addition to 3 now, in addition to a number of one-offs. We make a series called The Fruitful Barrel, where it's meant to be pretty fruit forward, but still really balanced, where the fruit is definitely kind of the lead actor, so to speak, but it's still meant to be a really well-balanced beer and not something that just presents as straight up fruit juice. We do another series called the Subtle Blend, which is where the fruit is more of a background player, where it's meant to kind of...
It's a team player.
It's definitely there, but it's meant to enhance the blend rather than dominate. And then we do fruited versions. We've recently released the first 2 fruited spontaneous beers that we did, one with raspberries and one with boysenberries. But we've also done some one-offs.
So the beer that you're drinking right now is actually our 3rd anniversary beer called 3 Orbits Around the Sun. And that has, the base beer is actually a smoked beer that we then re-fermented with tay berries, which is a berry that no one knows what it is. They're delicious.
I've never heard of them before, yeah.
Yeah, they're a cross between a raspberry and a blackberry. They look like the biggest blackberry you've ever seen.
Yeah.
But they present a little bit more like a raspberry. They're really savory. And that beer, I don't know if we can recreate it. We probably can, but it was kind of intended as a one-off just to see what would happen. It turned into something really lovely, though. It's only 4.5%, which is kind of surprising. But it's just really nice and balanced and savory, and it's just a food beer.
Well, and you had me a smoked beer with fruit in it, which doesn't, on paper sound like something that a lot of people would want to drink. And yet, as you drink it, the smoke is just a small component that, adds a kind of, rich woodiness to it, and, a little bit of just a touch of kind of peppery, phenolic, element to it. And that actually complements some of that kind of berry phenolic character that also pushes it. But the thing that I get out of it is almost this wine-like, taste on the palate that doesn't necessarily even taste like beer that much. That it, that it just has this fullness, even for such a small thing that that captures us. And that's a nice element to it. The acid is in a very controlled place. It's there, but it's very small, and is a kind of complementary element to this rather than driving it as some sort of quote unquote sour beer. And it pulls together as this very drinkable, beer that's full of that rich, lush berry character.
Thank you. That is definitely a recurring theme with our use of fruit, is that a lot of fruited beers, I would say, tend to be either very sweet or very tart. And we like to pursue something where it's not really either of those things. We like to work with fruit where the end product is very dry, but without any kind of harsh tartness to it. So dry but soft is what we look for there. And I think the level of fruit in this is similar to what you'd see in our Fruitful Barrel series, but with the lightly smoked base, it kind of gives it a little bit of a different angle, which is kind of fun. And working with smoke, we also have a beer on the table here called the Gentle Hint of Smoke, which is inspired by a Lichtenheiner, which lightly smoky, lightly tart. You mentioned wine-like. I actually find a little bit cocktail-like, almost the notes of gin or mezcal, because it's so dry. You don't have that kind of barbecue meaty sweetness that you get out of a lot of smoked beers. It really transforms into something else, and that dryness is definitely a recurring theme. I mean, we never inhibit our fermentation anyway, so we let everything ferment dry. Most of our finishing gravities typically end up below 1.0. If we have a beer that's at 10.02, then we worry a little bit, like, is it really, is it done? Right. Or is this going to keep fermenting? So it's more typical that we'll end up around
996,
998. I mean, 10.02 is about as high as we go. And that's, as I said, that always makes us a little bit nervous. So that dryness, definitely a recurring theme.
And yet, as dry as it is, there's still this kind of round mouth feel and a fullness to it that that doesn't feel thin, and helps keep that berry flavor as well as that smoke flavor from feeling sharp. What do you do to kind of massage it in that direction?
Well, we use fresh fruit, which definitely I think contributes a lot more. Using fresh, locally grown fruit, really, you get that complexity that you would never get using something like a fruit extract. At least I don't think that you would. But also, I feel like mixed fermentation.
When honestly, you say that, what do you think is contributing to that from that whole fruit? Other acids fitting into it, or are there other elements that are coming from that fruit that you think that it's? I
think so. I think using the whole fruit, using the skin, using every part of the fruit, really, you're going to get flavors that, if you try to isolate all the components, may not seem like the most desirable flavors, but that's in working together, they can really enhance what's there. And that goes to a lot of our philosophy too, that not only have we never purchased yeast in the history of Garden Path, we've also never isolated any individual strain. We take a very holistic view where we feel like the community of microbes that's responsible for our fermentation can't be understood in its entirety by studying its individual components, that they affect one another's behavior, they influence one another in a way that you may not get if you just isolate each individual organism and try to see what it contributes. So we embrace all of it, and our analysis is almost entirely sensory in terms of how is the community behaving, and if it starts to get off track, then how can we help to kind of steer it back in the right direction? So I think that working with that community of organisms is a big part of it. And I know we're here to talk about beer, but looking at some of the other beverages that we also make, because we're a winery and cidery and meadery as well as a brewery. I mean, mead is something where you would think that a mead that starts relatively low in terms of gravity and then finishes super dry, conventional thinking is that's going to be really watery. But something that I found in some home mead making experiences is that if you use a mixed culture to ferment it, then you get this perception of body, you get this perception of complexity and richness that in theory you shouldn't get, and that you wouldn't get if you just fermented that with a straight up champagne yeast and it just converted all the sugar into alcohol and CO2. That there are just these other compounds that are present, these byproducts of fermentation that are present, that just add to that nuance and sophistication, even in the absence of residual sugar or higher alcohol content.
And the other interesting thing about our yeast culture is that it expresses differently in different conditions. So colder weather fermentations, the past year, winter was spontaneous season, but if we have done, fall or winter, open foeder ferments, you get much more of I call it Christmas spice note on the beer than you do if it's a warmer weather fermentation. So you get like cinnamon and clove and nutmeg. But in warmer weather, it's a lot more floral. And the base of our yeast culture is flowers, actually. So, I mean, that kind of makes sense. But it's just really interesting which organisms are most active and most happy in different conditions.
Let's, I know you've mentioned it a couple of times now about open foeder fermentation, and then, of course, also how you've sourced your the yeast culture that you ferment with. Let's talk about that a little bit, just so that people understand exactly what you're talking about. But before we do that, the founders launched SS Brewtech with a very clear goal to advance brewing equipment design, performance, and quality to the very highest standards in the industry. With a team that draws upon strong functional backgrounds in brewing science, mechanical engineering, industrial design, supply chain, and manufacturing, SS Brewtech has the people and skill sets you'd want to expect from your supplier of pro brewing equipment. Head over to ssbrewtech.com for more information on their brew houses and brewing gear. Also, when it comes to brewing, nobody has your back like Clarion, because their food-grade lubricants are formulated to help make your brewing system 100% food safe. That means when you switch to Clarion, you can put the costly potential of contamination and recall out of your mind. All you need to worry about is brewing great beer, and since you already do that, well, it's more like focusing on business as usual. Go to clarionlubricants.com to learn more. And so you all, right now, you're building out, you have a brewery here, but you're now currently sourcing wort from another brewery just down the road and fermenting here. You're in the process of installing an actual brew house.
I'll say we're making wort at the brewery down the road. Sourcing it makes it sound kind of like we're using their wort.
You have a brewer. They go there. They brew your wort there, of course. No, you're right. I didn't phrase that correctly.
It is. It's just, I think it's an important point of clarification.
Absolutely.
Because we're not just outsourcing our wort production. We're not using another brewery's wort fermenting it differently. Though doing that, I mean, that would be interesting. I'm sure we would have very different results fermenting Chuckanut's wort with our yeast. But the wort that we're making there is something that's wholly designed and overseen by us with their help. I mean, we do definitely take advantage of their labor from their brewers as well.
We don't take advantage of it.
We don't take advantage of it. I mean, we not in a bad way.
You benefit from the experience.
Thank you. We benefit from the assistance of their highly skilled team as well in our production, but it is all designed and overseen by us. So
talk me through that process. You design a base of some sort of beer that you then want have some idea of how it might end up, or at least you have some idea that it could go in a direction that you want it to go to. Just because otherwise you wouldn't invest in doing that. And but then so you towed it back here to the Garden Path facility, and what are the next steps?
Typically, a batch that we brew at Chuckanut will fill 2 350-gallon totes. We get about 18 barrels of finished wort from their system generally, and we'll bring those totes back here. We'll send the wort for non-spontaneous fermentation. We'll send the wort through their heat exchanger, bring it back here at fermentation temperature, and then transfer into our open foeder by gravity, just elevating the tote with our forklift and emptying it into the foeder with our yeast culture. When we were brewing every week pre-COVID, we were basically just going batch to batch. We were pulling the yeast out, giving the foeder a good rinse, but not scrubbing it out by any means, and then just putting the yeast pitch from the last batch back in with the fresh wort. Now, since we slowed down production, we stopped production entirely for a while during COVID and then slowed down quite a bit afterwards. We're having to vary that technique a little bit more, and we actually haven't done that much brewing with our house yeast since reopening, because we went essentially from the end of the 2019-2020 spontaneous season to more or less the beginning of the 2020-2021 spontaneous
Although
season.
The first thing we threw at our yeast after it had been just kind of chilling for a couple months was Black is Beautiful collaboration with Otherlands, which was maybe too much to throw at it initially, but it's turned into something really cool. We're going to release it later this year.
It did rise to the occasion. Before that, we had done a batch of beer we call the Wet Hop Chip, which we use fresh hops from a farm just a few miles from here that planted their first hops the same week that we opened here at Garden Path, and we've purchased everything they've grown since. It's our friends Amy and Byron at Hop Skagit, who we have really wonderful relationship with. We hope that someday they and other growers here in the valley will grow enough hops to meet all of our needs. But anyway, so that was kind of our first revival, though we used mostly yeast from the previous spontaneous season for that beer. So as Amber said, our first real test of our reviving our house culture was Black is Beautiful.
Which is also the first stout we've ever made.
Yeah.
So it was a challenge for the yeast, but it worked out.
But for our spontaneous beers, we do a little bit of a different technique where we bring back one of the totes with wort that's still hot. That goes through the heat exchanger without any cooling, so it's still coming back here at about 185 degrees, and we let that sit in our cool ship overnight to become naturally inoculated with airborne microbes. And for our first 2 years, what we did is we would then send that wort in the morning directly into 500 or 600 liter puncheons and let it ferment on its own. And then the other half of the batch we would treat completely separately. We would ferment it in the open foeder with our house yeast and then save it as barrel stock for fruiting or blending in the future. Starting our third year, we bought a closed top vertical foeder from winery in California, cleaned it out, and decided to use that as kind of a Solera vessel for our spontaneous fermentation, where with the first batch, we took the cooled portion of the wort, put it into that foeder, and then the next day inoculated it with the wort from the cool ship without adding any other form of yeast. And then the next time that we brewed, we transferred that the beer that was in the process of spontaneous fermentation from the closed foeder into puncheons for extended aging, and put the next batch of wort in using that same process, but without scrubbing out the foeder. So there was some residual yeast from the previous spontaneous fermentations. We kind of built up a resident native culture each of the 2 seasons that we've done that. We cleaned it out again in between because it hadn't been used in the better part of a year. But
and you're not tying yourself to any of these historical definitions of these things, and so that process or adhering to a strict iteration of processes is not your jam.
It's not, and I've talked to a number of Belgian brewers about the process that we use, and I think we could have an extended debate about whether this kind of Solera process is spontaneous or non-spontaneous. It's not unprecedented in Belgium, I'll say for sure. But in a way, it doesn't really matter. I mean, I feel like it meets the definition. We've never used any yeast other than native yeast, but when we use the term spontaneous, what we're suggesting is that there was never any direct pitch of yeast. It was never, it was relying entirely on airborne microbes that were captured through the cool ship.
Right.
And if the microbes from one batch kind of linger in the vessel to the next, I still feel like that kind of meets the criteria. And if anyone wants to debate that, that's fine. I'm not really that concerned about it.
Making beer that tastes good, that people want to drink is certainly more important than making beer that fits a definition.
We're in Washington. We're not in Belgium. We're not going to call anything lambic. So,
I will say there is a real distinction, though, between our spontaneous process and our non-spontaneous process, in that when we were capturing and cultivating our house culture, our goal was to have it be as Saccharomyces dominant as possible. So with the yeast capture, we used mason jars of wort, we used hopped wort, we used wort that went through the heat exchanger and was at cooler temperatures, because we felt that both of those things would favor Saccharomyces over other organisms that might be present here. We also felt that the natural climate here would be much more conducive to Saccharomyces with the cool summer temperatures, that the fact that it rarely gets much over 80 degrees here, that things that prefer warmer temperatures like Brettanomyces, Lactobacillus, Pediococcus, Acetobacter, that they would not thrive as much in this climate as Saccharomyces would. And we really tried to play on that by using the cooled hopped wort for that yeast capture. And
when you say, so for this yeast capture, you place these mason jars with this cooled hopped wort, in varying, places.
We tried that, and that didn't work quite so well.
Okay.
But most of those experiments were in a vineyard and orchard that at the time we were considering buying, but it was not an organic vineyard and orchard, so I don't think there was that much yeast to capture. What we ended up doing, there's always a day in Washington where, like early in April, where all of a sudden it feels like every flower in the world is in bloom. And so that day we went out and we picked like one of every flower that we saw and made a very simple batch of hoppy wort. Filled a bunch of mason jars. Our kitchen was just like all mason jars for a couple months, and just put a flower in each one and let them go and see what would. I mean, you could visually tell that some of them were not turning into something particularly lovely. But after a few months, some things were clearly fermenting. Some things actually smelled really good. So then we tasted them, and some of them tasted better than others. But we combined the ones that we liked the best, and that's the base of our culture. So our site search took us longer than we anticipated, as it does for everyone.
Right.
But it was almost exactly the right amount of time to continue building up this culture to the point where when we were about to open, we could brew our first batch. And that's actually what we're drinking right now. It's a beer we released much later called Our First Take Time. And this was a half batch at Chuckanut, but it's a really interesting expression of where yeast culture was when it started. This beer was remarkably clean.
Right.
And it just has a very different kind of character than the first beer that you had, which was the easygoing drink. But I mean, it was a long process to get from 4 mason jars to a 10-barrel batch.
And that initial experiment we kept repeating too. So
Yeah.
what we did with flowers, we then did more mason jars with leaves, with berries, just with anything that we thought might be an interesting yeast source here.
Lots of mason jars.
And it was just saving the good ones, combining them, getting rid of the bad ones, and really trying to naturally select for these kind of soft, subtle, balanced flavors that we like to pursue. When we use the coolship, we're, of course, getting a very different cross-section because the wort is starting out hot and slowly passing through this much warmer temperature range. So even though there may not be as much Brettanomyces and Lacto and PDO and Acetobacter and other organisms present here as there would be in warmer climates, that wort is still going to be very attractive to what is present, and it's going to cause those organisms to settle in and get to work before Saccharomyces takes over and will therefore produce very different results. So we'll open a bottle of our spontaneous ferment here, and you can taste what's going on with it.
Now, you also, with this culture that you developed, you mentioned you open fermented. Talk to me about that benefit of brewing, fermenting in a open top fooder for fermentation.
Yeah, I like to think of it as kind of free-range yeast. That yeast is, during fermentation, it's often under a lot of pressure in most brewing environments, especially if breweries are using very tall cylindroconical fermenters, which are great for saving floor space and really maximizing efficiency. But they're not as, and they're great for yeast collection because that yeast will really get forced down into the base of that cone in a way that makes it easy to separate it from the fermenting beer and then repitch it. But you're usually not going to want to do that more than a few times because that puts a lot of stress on the yeast when it's got all that mass sitting on top of it, and then back pressure from the CO2 that's venting out of the top of the tank, but probably not venting out quite as quickly as it's being formed. So that's just a lot of stress on the yeast. And by fermenting in an open fooder, working in an environment where There's no back pressure because the CO2 can vent out freely, where the yeast can coat the sides of the vessel, where we don't have a lot of depth of liquid because we're only filling up the foeder typically a little over halfway, and where the bottom is wider than the top, so it can really spread out. It means that collection is going to be more of a challenge, that we're going to end up bringing a lot of the beer from whatever batch we're brewing now into whatever we brew next. But it means that the yeast is really, it's not stressed and it can keep going. And we've been able to, by using this process, we've been able to reuse our house culture over 80 times at this point. And at the time, COVID, as I said, has presented a challenge because it was this extended hiatus. But up to that point, the yeast just showed no signs of fatigue at all. It was really in great shape. So now
from a production standpoint, though, you have to have a fresh wort, as soon as you finish that next one, right, to keep it going?
We have a brink, so if there was any break, we would transfer the yeast into a brink, a converted keg, and feed it small amounts of wort as needed.
We can run over to check it out and get a gallon.
Yeah, even if we're not brewing, they probably are. So hitting them up for a gallon of wort to feed the yeast is not such a big deal. Or we can feed it apple juice or something else if we needed to keep it going. There's actually plenty of apple juice available here. So that's not a problem. But yeah, normally we were brewing frequently enough to just go batch to batch and pull the yeast out and start the next one. We look forward to getting back to that point, hopefully sometime soon.
Yeah, sure. After that fermentation process, after that open fermentation, what's the next step in your process?
The beer often tells us. So most things go into barrels. Do you know how many? Did you count the barrels?
No, I didn't count.
We're not sure how many active barrels we have at this point. A couple hundred.
Yeah, maybe 300. Hard to say exactly.
Sure, we move them in and out. So
some things, the first beer that we tasted together, the easygoing drink, that's one that typically will actually be a little bit of quicker production. It'll go from the open foeder into probably stainless secondary, but sometimes we may blend in some older beer from barrels for complexity if we feel that it needs it. Or we may, that batch that you tasted actually was kind of unique in that we actually cool shipped it because we felt like, well, why not? Let's do it. And then it ended up spending a lot of time in barrels because, again, COVID, we weren't packaging right away, so transferred it into barrels and just kind of left it on its own for quite a while. So that was a different take on that beer, but normally that's one that would be relatively quick production and something that's lower gravity, that's not a challenge for the yeast, that is pretty straightforward. We might be able to turn that around a little bit quicker and go right into stainless. Usually we don't want to leave anything in the open foeder for more than about a week because we don't want it to get overly oxidized. If it's not actively off-gassing CO2 anymore, then the advantages of being in the open vessel really start to dwindle and the disadvantages begin to outweigh the advantages. So we really only want to leave it in there while it's in pretty active fermentation, and then typically transfer it from there to closed vessels, whether that's stainless or oak or whatever we decide makes the most sense for that batch.
Sure. And then we give it a lot of time.
Right.
Patience is really our best friend here. And once we package, everything is naturally conditioned, so that's even more time.
Naturally conditioned with local honey. The only variation on that is that we've done some experiments with spunding, where we're packaging a little bit before fermentation is complete. That was something that we couldn't really do before. We did actually one of our very, very first experiments was a spund keg, which oddly we still get reviews of popping up every now and then. I don't know where people are drinking this beer because there was only one keg of it, which was
in our tap room
in
2018.
Which was finished in 2018. So if you're listening to this
sheer magic of Untapped,
and you really enjoyed the experimental spund recently, then you may be a little bit confused. But yeah, it's something that we've kind of played around with a little bit. But our yeast was so aggressive in its fermentation for a while that it was
hard to time that.
We would have the time that it would have taken to transfer the actively fermenting beer would have changed the amount to which it had been fermented. So it wasn't really something that was viable at that point, but it's something that we could play around with again in smaller batches.
We did with the lager ale.
Yeah, we did actually.
We made a super fun beer this winter. We're calling it the Skagitonian Lager Ale, which is confusing, but basically we wanted to see. There's probably lager yeast in our culture.
That sounds like something that the Texas legislature would force you to call a beer.
Well, thank God we don't have to deal with them anymore.
Yeah.
But we're pretty sure we have lager yeast in our culture. I don't know. But basically, we wanted to see if we could lager a beer in barrels outdoors this winter. And it worked. We brought the barrels inside at night if it was going to be too cold, but left them outside during the day. They were outside during a snowstorm after primary was mostly finished.
Our one snowstorm
that we had. But it turned into something super cool. So it's kind of our take on a lager using the methods that we have available to us and using nature basically as our best friend.
We don't actually know yet if the TTB will approve.
Yeah, we don't know if that's going to be the official name.
But we'll see.
Right. But that one we did spooned, so we did package that a little bit early.
Let's talk to me about the honey, conditioning process, especially as you're using local honey. How do you, calculate how that's going to affect and and work through that kind of natural conditioning process?
Well, it's in some ways it's relatively straightforward for us because we can take the density of the honey doesn't vary too much. We usually figure it's about 81% sugar, and that all of that sugar is going to ferment. With our culture, we don't really have to worry too much about whether there's going to be some unfermentable sugar in there. It's all going to get
It's going to eat all of that honey sugar.
And with knowing that our finishing gravities are going to go where they are, that if the beer is at 998 before we add the honey, that's pretty much where we know it's going to end up. That makes it relatively easy in that sense. But of course, we're working with unrefined sugar. We're working with a natural product that has some variation to it. We're working with native yeast. So there are definitely some unanticipated variations. And with kegs, if the keg is over or under, we can adjust that a little bit after the fact by venting off some of the CO2 and reducing the carbonation in that way if it goes over, or if we need to push it with a little bit more CO2 to push up the carbonation a little bit, we can do that as well. With bottles, obviously it's trickier but bottles are a little bit more forgiving. So if we have a range, sometimes we may be a little bit at the low end of the range, sometimes we may be a little bit at the high end, but that's kind of the nature of bottle conditioning. Regardless, even if you're using refined sugar, it's still there's a lot of touch and go with it and a learning curve.
Sure. The fact that you all are also a meadery, I think, means you have some experience using it terms of...
Well, and the reason that we use honey for conditioning is that it is a local product. Yeah. There isn't a dextrose farm in the valley. So
dextrose farm.
No one's growing dextrose here. It's true. Yeah. But we did have one batch. So far, the only thing that we have that, unless you remember anything else, there's only one thing that we have not been able to release based on carbonation levels, and that was our first batch, or second batch technically, of strawberry mead. It seemed to hit a really nice carbonation level, and we were getting ready to print labels and release it, and we took some to a dinner that we did. And
I'm standing at the front of the room talking about mead, talking about how we made this product, and then everyone at the tables just gasped, and I turned around and it had basically hit the ceiling.
Server standing there with a geysering bottle, and that one we couldn't actually explain it because it did hit terminal gravity. It seemed like
we think it was undergoing malolactic in the bottle. That was our best guess as to what happened, but that's the one thing we have not, unfortunately, because it was a beautiful, beautiful product, been able to release.
Yeah, everything else has pretty much gotten there.
Just do it Tilken style and empty the bottles back out into barrels and age it again. And it becomes strawberry mead squared.
Well, we actually did an experiment with something similar to that with part of that batch. So, and it turned out all right. We were pretty happy with how that worked. But yeah, I mean, most everything else, there are a couple things where we wouldn't have minded if it had picked up a little bit more CO2 or a little bit less, but we haven't had anything else where it's been really hugely problematic.
How do you, integrate the honey itself with the liquid of the beer? I mean, you're talking about different viscosities of, dextrose is easy enough as to integrate into a liquid like that, but integrating honey, because it's so viscous, is a different kind of challenge.
We usually blend the honey with water first to reduce the density, and typically it'll be about a 1-to-1 ratio of honey to water just to get it to liquid form. That's a little bit easier.
You do it under heat then, or
not super warm, but just warm enough
to dissolve.
Enough to help it all flow. And
for our meads, we actually usually use room temperature water. We don't use a heat method because we really want to preserve the aromatics of the honey. But for conditioning, we'll use warm water to get it dissolved, and then once it's mixed and liquid, then we'll do some recirculation with the beer.
And we dose differently for kegs and bottles. So we'll dose for kegs and then do a second dose for bottles.
Yeah, that is something that we started doing more recently because we did find that the same dosing for kegs and bottles would typically result in overcarbonated kegs that were difficult to serve. So that's actually been the bigger challenge, that our bottles for the most part have hit the range that we've aimed for. But with kegs, it's been a little trickier to kind of find that sweet spot.
Tell me about one of the most exciting fermentation experiments that you've engaged in over the past 6 months. What is you watch these things develop and move in different directions, but is there one in particular that has just been thrilling for you to watch and unexpected, or helped you learn something that you weren't familiar with before?
Well, I wouldn't call this a great learning experience, but the coolest thing that we've done in the past 6 months is we packaged our first 1, 2, and 3-year-old spontaneous blend, which, first of all, is a nice testimony to the fact that we've been around for 3 years and had 3 spontaneous seasons. But it's that's just turned into something really beautiful, and we'll probably release that later this fall. But we bottled it a month or two ago, and it's just turning out so wonderful. So that's not a great learning experience, but it's a cool thing that we did.
Sure. Now, talk to me about, the blending process on that. I mean, I imagine you aren't pulling from thousands of barrels. Clearly, you don't have a humongous amount of spontaneous stock. How did you go about building the idea of this beer with, multiple years?
Well, frankly, we only had 2 barrels of our first spontaneous batch we actually made it in May of 2018. We pushed the season a little bit.
It's May 1st. Yeah.
May 1st, yeah. And this was kind of a weird production shutdown gift, but before production shut down for COVID, we tasted both of those barrels, and they were just weird. They weren't in a bad place, but they weren't great. And we had a little discussion about what to do with them, and it was like, you know what, these are our oldest barrels. Let's just let them be and, taste them later when we think about it. So 6 or 7 months later, we decided to taste them, and they turned into something just gorgeous and lovely, and it was just forgetting about them. This is kind of a lesson that we've learned. Sometimes if you forget about something for an extended period of time and just go back and revisit it, it will surprise you in a really wonderful way. So, I mean, we had 2 barrels that we knew were going to be our base, and one lesson we have definitely learned about blending is you blend from the hardest barrel. You start with whatever is kind of the trickiest and strangest, and then blend it to the place where you actually want it to be.
Yeah, I think captured that pretty well. So, starting with those, we were pleasantly surprised at how they turned out. That does tend to be, I guess, our solution to a lot of problems and dilemmas is just give it time,
just
see what happens.
Yeah.
And as long as there's space to do that, at a certain point you kind of have to pull the plug on some things if seems like they're not getting any better. And frankly, those barrels may have been close to that point before they rounded the corner there. So I'm glad that we didn't. But yeah, starting with that, then a lot of it, and I've got to credit our production team with this, our production and cellar team with this much more so than myself at this point, is just being familiar with what's in the cellar and having a sense of like what's going to go with this. And it's kind of like it's a chef knowing your pantry, knowing like what's going to work with this to kind of give it what it needs. And that's the blending side of it. So thinking about like what would complement this out of the range of 2-year-old barrels that we have available. And then once you have the blend of the 2-year-old and the 3-year-old, then
what do we need from the 1-year-old
barrels will round it out the best. And this was, we call our 3-year blend, technically it was actually kind of a 4-year blend because we used coolship wort to prime it rather than honey. So this was also an exception to our priming with honey. So we used wort from the current season as a priming agent in this. So it has the 3 years of barrel-aged spontaneous beer along with some fresh wort from the coolship.
That's pretty fun. Zooming out for a bit, in the big picture, what does success look like for you all with Garden Path? How do you define it, and how will you know when you've achieved it?
Does anyone ever know?
I think for me, a lot of what I hope to achieve is to build something that will last beyond us. To I guess veer into some of my personal side of things, we don't have kids. We're not going to have kids at this point. It's not something that we ever really wanted, and I think a lot of people achieve their sense of immortality by future generations. For us, it's by what we create and by influencing people that are both part of our team and that enjoy our creations, hopefully are inspired by them, and hoping to leave something behind in that way. So I hope that we can build something that will last for many generations and that will help to inspire other people to engage in their own creative endeavors. That's really, for me, that would be a large part of it. And, to be sustainable on a business level, to make sure that we're generating enough money to continue operating and to make sure that the business can sustain itself. But beyond that, we don't have a lot in the way of financial ambitions. I guess we want to create a sustainable business that can give back and that can contribute positively to the community for generations to come. So I'd say that's the biggest thing. And I'd like people who appreciate the sort of thing that we do to have an opportunity to try it and hopefully enjoy it. So really being able to get our products out there to a wider audience. We know that we're appealing to minority. Not everyone is after what we do, but I think there is a subset of people out there who really do appreciate subtlety and nuance and soft, balanced flavors in the way that we do, and who hopefully will appreciate what we're creating here. And I guess success for me is being able to get our products to them and to really have them enjoyed in the way that we enjoy them.
Yeah, well, that's well said. Thank you all for joining me on the podcast today. It's been really fun to talk to you about this kind of wild or semi-wild and variation approach and taking a lot of different pathways to achieve multiple and different kinds of ends that all still hang together. G&D Chillers is the brewing industry's premier choice for glycol chilling. Set your compass by Raw North Star Pills. Benefit from the scale of Old Orchard. Set up your account on marketmybrewery.com today. SS Brewtech is advancing brewing equipment design, performance, and quality. And gain peace of mind with Clarion Lubricants. Of course, if you'd like to support this podcast, go to beerandbrewing.com. If you're a pro brewer, consider the All Access Pro subscriptions. And Amber and Ron, if people want to learn more about Garden Path Fermentation, where do they find you in real life and out there in the digital realms?
Our handle for everything, including our website, is gardenpathwa.com.
And in real life, you can find us in Skagit Valley, about halfway between Seattle and Vancouver, BC, just a couple miles off of I-5. So if you're ever traveling in that direction, especially once the border reopens, then we're a good stopping point along the way. And Skagit Valley is also known for its annual Tulip Festival, which takes place every April. So we get a lot of people coming up to visit that. If you're into tulips, come and see the tulips.
People are into
then,
tulips.
Stop in for a beer, cider, or wine, mead, whatever you happen to want to drink.
For sure. And your beer is distributed out, in various states and can be found through some distributors.
It is, yeah. We were actually we were distributed throughout the U.S. largely through Shelton Brothers Network, right, which unfortunately is no longer in existence in quite the way that it was, but a lot of places where you can find some of the other beers that Shelton Brothers once imported. You should be able to find our products as well. And if you can't find us where you are, ask your local retailer, shoot us an email, do whatever, and we'll try to get some stuff there. We also do ship statewide in Washington, and if you happen to be in the Seattle area, we do bi-weekly deliveries down that way as well.
Well, fantastic. It's been wonderful to talk to you all in this bucolic location in the Skagit Valley, and a wonderful and beautiful afternoon with all the sounds of nature around us. Thanks, and thanks for sharing beers with me. Cheers.
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 This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.